Today I'm going to be talking about the most talented chess player of all time, and it's not Magnus Carlsen, or Bobby Fischer, or Garry Kasparov, or even the legendary Paul Morphy. And before I make my case for who I think it is, I want to show you something. This is a current list of the 50 best chess players in the world, along with the age that they began playing chess. You'll notice that every one of them began playing at a young age, and there isn't anyone on this list that began playing after the age of 10. And there's a reason for that. And it's not because there's nobody who learned after the age of 10 willing to put in the time and effort to become a world-class player, but rather there is a generally observed phenomenon, not only in chess, but in other areas as well, like in music and language, which is that if a person begins playing as a child, they will have a much higher chance of eventually becoming a world-class player, as opposed to taking up the game later in life. For the vast majority, if you haven't begun your chess journey by the time you reach adulthood, then you will almost certainly never join the ranks of the world's elite, no matter how hard you try. It is virtually impossible, but that doesn't mean it hasn't happened. And one of the most striking exceptions to this rule is a 19th century British player by the name of Joseph Henry Blackburn, who was such a fearsome player that he earned himself the nickname the Black Death. This guy didn't learn how to play chess until the ripe old age of around 17 or 18 years old, which is actually around the age that I started playing chess, but unlike me, within only 3 years' time, he achieved the following. He first became the champion of his local chess club in Manchester, England. He then placed 9th in a strong international tournament, even winning a game against future world champion Wilhelm Steinitz, who was already in his 20s at the time and one of the best players alive. He learned how to play blindfold up to 10 people at a time and would give exhibitions. I mean, this guy is nuts. He must have had a truly incredible mind. And on top of all of that, he was apparently quite fond of whiskey and reportedly drank significantly even while playing. He actually said he thought it helped him play better, if you can believe that. Now, only 10 years after he learned how to play, in 1869, Blackburn became the British champion and would be considered to be among the world's top 5 players for the next 20 years. At different times, he's even ranked as high as number 2 by Chessmetrics. He has scored wins against world champions Steinitz and Lasker, and you might be thinking, this guy must have just worked his butt off to get this good at chess at such a late age, right? But it kind of sounds like this might not be the case. Emanuel Lasker said that he thought Blackburn had even more talent than Steinitz, but that he lacked the willpower and capacity for hard work needed for him to become world champion. Are you kidding me? If you compare Blackburn to someone like Bobby Fischer, who did nothing but live, eat, and breathe chess from the time he was 6 years old, it seems almost unbelievable that Blackburn was able to get so close to becoming the #1 player in the world while being a somewhat lazy drinker who didn't start playing until his late teens. What insane amount of natural talent does that require? So enough said, let's just let his chess speak for itself as we take a look at some of Joseph Blackburn's, aka the Black Death's, most brilliant games. I'm going to show you some sacrificial combinations that will absolutely blow your mind. He's even got a famous opening trap named after him, which we'll take a look at toward the end of the video, so stick around for that. But to kick things off, we're going to go back to the year 1883. Blackburn has the white pieces against Wilhelm Steinitz, who is only 2 years away from becoming world champion, and Blackburn gets the party started with e4, a man after my own heart. We have a king's pawn opening on the board, looking like we might be headed into a 4-knight scenario, but no. Steinitz instead opts for the Steinitz defense, because he likes what it's called, and because unlike most players nowadays, he actually thinks it's a good opening. But the engine hates it, and you might be thinking it's because Black is going to fianchetto that bishop to a diagonal which is blocked by his own pawn, but the real reason it sucks has more to do with the loss of time. Why take that pawn move to open a diagonal for your bishop when you already have one available? Not exactly principled. And Blackburn, like a modern-day grandmaster, knows just how to respond. d4. Let's hit the center, go for rapid development, and let's punish Steinitz for his sins. We have e takes d4, knight takes d4, and if you're familiar with the accelerated dragon variation of the Sicilian defense, you might notice that this looks strikingly similar, only difference being that black's e-pawn has been traded for the white d-pawn instead of his c-pawn, as in the dragon. So what we have here is inferior because black has only one central pawn. He does not have the open c-file for potential counterplay on the queen side if white were to castle over there and then launch the king side assault. So Blackburn continues to play like an engine with bishop to e3, but after knight to f6 from Steinitz, he misses the mark. His best move would have been knight takes c6. If you capture with the d-pawn, we're going to trade queens like this, castle with check. Black will be left with the compromised pawn structure, the king who can't castle, and he's lagging in development. Not great. If you capture with the b-pawn instead, here comes e5, sending the knight back home, or to d5 if black's in the mood to lose a pawn. But in the game, Blackburn opted for the overly tame bishop to e2. We have castles, castles, and now instead of staking his claim in the center immediately with d5 like he should, Steinitz moves his knight away from the center with this weird looking move, knight to e7. And when I first saw this, I thought, okay, maybe some extra coverage of d5, he's going to play that next, but Steinitz is actually planning d6. So best for Blackburn here would be to try to prevent d5 because that's still black's best move. A good way to do that would have been bishop to f4, which he didn't play, but the point is after d5, you got knight b to d5 targeting c7 with threats to the rook, which black should really defend with knight to e8. But from Blackburn, instead we have bishop to f3. Okay, at least he's thinking about the center, adding some indirect coverage to d5, which black can still play. It is his best move, but Steinitz is sold on d6, so that's what he does, with the idea of knight to d7 and then to e5, which is fine, except that it just takes too many moves and that e5 is not much of an outpost for the knight anyway, as it's just going to get kicked around with the move f4, as you'll see. But here we go, like Johnny23 said, it's happening. Now Blackburn remembers from his chess studies that you're supposed to play bishop to h6 and trade off the dark squared bishops, leaving the dark squared holes around the black king, which you can later penetrate with your pieces with disastrous effect. But the engine says white should focus on central play with something like rook a to d1 instead. This is actually one of those situations where it's good for black to take on h6, which Steinitz didn't do, but this draws the queen away from the central action, where she is really not doing much. Now if you had a rook on h1, you could get an attack going with h4, h5, or if you had some pieces that could gather around the black king and assist with an attack there, it might be better. But here, the white queen just isn't really doing a whole lot, and so is better placed on d2. But Steinitz did not capture on h6. He played knight to e5, allowing Blackburn to initiate the capture. And now Steinitz is faced with an interesting question. Do you throw in knight takes f3 with check before recapturing on g7 or not? He chose king takes g7, appraising his knight at a higher value than the bishop, but after bishop to e2, that knight is just going to get driven back with f4. So maybe it was a little better to take out that bishop. f6 now from Steinitz. He wants the f7 square for his knight. Better would be to move it to c6 because it takes one less move and it challenges the white pony in the center. But to each their own, here comes f4. The knight goes to f7, Blackburn now centralizes his rook, and we have c6. Now why exactly Steinitz played this move, I don't know. It does allow the queen to get to b6 with some nice activity, but Steinitz never ended up playing that. Maybe he's looking for expansion on the queen side with b5 at some point. A possibility which did not deter Blackburn from now putting his bishop on c4. Because he has concocted a very sinister plan. Steinitz, oblivious to any problem at all, just blissfully continues his development with bishop to d7, but the scale is now tipped so heavily in white's favor that he really didn't have anything significantly better. And this marks the beginning of the end for Steinitz, as Blackburn now begins his final and fatal sequence of moves by capturing the knight on f7. Removing the defender of the d6 pawn. And after rook takes f7, he plays f5, threatening to infiltrate to e6 with the knight, which will be followed by queen takes d6. So Steinitz adds defense to the d6 pawn with this ugly move, knight to c8. And we have a position which looks like it should be significantly better for white. Black is passively defending. These pieces are pretty pathetic, but it's not really obvious just how white should proceed. I mean, do you play knight e6 here, or maybe rook to f3, go to g3 or h3, try to attack on the king side? White actually has a lot of moves here that maintain his winning status, but Blackburn finds one of the most concrete and forcing solutions with a gorgeous move that many players wouldn't even consider, and that is e5. What a breakthrough! The pawn can be captured in two different ways, neither of which is good for black. Steinitz realized immediately that d takes e5 is impossible due to knight to e6 check, which wins the black queen. It's a fork, and if bishop takes e6, then bye-bye queen. So, Steinitz plays f takes e5. The knight hops into e6 anyway, with the fork. It must be captured. F takes e6, now hits the rook. Now, if you trade on f1, white's going to end up getting a rook into f7 just way too quickly. So best is to try what Steinitz played, rook to e7. Let's get that rook in front of the pawn. Hopefully there will be time to win it, and we have some coverage of f7. Now here Blackburn plays one of his only inaccurate moves in the game, queen to g5, which gave Steinitz a chance to escape. The strongest move for white in this position was actually knight to e4. And to fully explain why this is best is beyond the scope of this video. We'd have to wade through a lot of variations. Let me just give you one sample line. Now, if black were to take on e6, then white can just start doubling on the f-file. He's also got ideas of rook to h3. The attack is coming way too quickly. So you can try to go for development instead with knight to b6, but now queen to f2 defends this e-pawn by threatening queen to f7 in response to rook takes pawn, which will be check and will win the rook. Rook d6 is a threat. If you try to push that pawn with d5, here comes knight to g5, protecting e6. You can't really kick the knight with h6 because then things get really nasty with queen to f6 check. And then after king g8, here comes knight to f7. Black is just completely toast here. But to compare this with what Blackburn played in the game, which was queen to g5, which looks nice, threatens rook to f7 since this rook is now pinned to the queen. You can't take unless you want to lose that queen. But here Steinitz could have possibly saved his game with knight to b6. Adds defense to the queen so this rook is no longer pinned and is eyeing the d5 square. Now you do have queen to f6 check, which is probably what Blackburn was looking at. But after king to g8, where is the strong follow-up for white? You can try knight to e4, but knight to d5 is coming with tempo on the queen. After she moves, black has queen to b6 with check, followed by queen to e3, and suddenly the position is not so clear. The engine actually says that here it's about equal. But getting back to the game, instead of the correct knight to b6, which could have possibly saved him, Steinitz instead played queen to e8. Okay, looks reasonable on the surface. He's going to get that e-pawn, but unfortunately that pawn is now of little relevance. After a powerful engine move from Mr. Black Death himself, rook to d3. And where do you think that rook is headed? Take a guess. f3? Oh no. After rook takes e6, rook to f3 gets us nowhere. That rook is going to h3. Threatening queen to h6, followed by queen takes h7. Now, I'm sure Steinitz saw this coming and thought that he had a defense with queen to e7. But after queen to h6 from Blackburn with check, king to g8, there is something Steinitz has missed, giving Blackburn a checkmate in 2 moves from here. See if you can spot it. Pause the video if you like. Take a look. Here it comes in 3, 2, 1, rook to f8 check. The black queen has double duty. She must capture on f8, which unfortunately means that h7 is left undefended, resulting in queen takes h7 checkmate. And you gotta respect Steinitz for not resigning a move earlier so that this pretty checkmate could actually appear on the board. I'm sure he saw this coming. So what a beautiful performance by Blackburn, playing like an engine way back in the 19th century, but this is nothing compared to what I am about to show you. In this position, Blackburn is playing black against an anonymous player, and after some opening craziness, finds himself down the exchange and down a couple pawns, but he does have the more active pieces and continues with the best move, the only good move, knight to f6. He's going to g4. And now white, instead of playing queen to d8 like he should, pinning that knight so it can't move, instead he plays c3, allowing knight to g4, threatening checkmate, hence the move h3, but here comes bishop takes f2 check. Okay, the king goes to h1, but now the bishop on f2 is pinned to the king, so what are you doing as black? Where's the strong follow-up? Queen to g3 almost works, only problem is it allows queen takes h7 with check. So now the white queen will be covering this file so that white can capture the knight and there will be no queen back to h4 with checkmate. So what does black do? Well, here Joseph Henry Black Death Blackburn unleashes a combination which is both stunningly beautiful and hideously fatal at the same time. It begins with bishop to f5, attacking the white queen, which has nowhere to run except, of course, to capture the rook, which is what is played. Now at this point, queen to g3 will mate in 3, but Blackburn finds an even quicker and prettier mate, beginning with, pause the video if you want to try to spot it, in 3, 2, 1. Queen takes h3 check. After g takes h3, bishop takes e4 is checkmate. Such a lovely Morphy-esque coordination of those minor pieces, but we are just warming up. This next one is from 1889. Blackburn has the white pieces up against Samuel Lipschutz, a very strong player who would go on to win the US Championship 3 years after this game, but here he succumbs to the Black Death in a spectacular way. Instead of capturing the knight on f4, which is the only move that doesn't lose, Lipschutz thinks he can get away with advancing his a-pawn with a4, which is a big mistake since it gives Blackburn an incredible forced mate in 9 moves, which he executes flawlessly, beginning with g6. Now, if you let the g file open, you're getting mated very quickly, so you have to try h6. But here comes the insane double piece sacrifice played by Blackburn, beginning with rook takes g7 check. Now if you don't take the rook, if you run to h8, then queen to h4 is next, targeting h6, so you gotta try king takes g7. That's what was played, but now the unthinkable happens. Blackburn sacks another piece, knight to h5 check. All this just so his queen can get into c7 with check. The knight is captured. You might as well, there's nothing better. We have queen to c7 check. Now if the king moves back to g8 or h8, it's mate in one move, so Lipschutz plays king to f6, but after queen to d6 check, he resigns, seeing that mate is coming in another 3 moves with king to g7, queen to e7. You can only delay mate by 1 move with rook to f7, and after queen takes f7 check, king h8, there's queen to h7 checkmate. What a combination, a forced mate in 9 executed flawlessly by the great Blackburn, who in this next position has the white pieces and has just been placed in check by an Austrian master by the name of Jacques Schwarz, with this pesky knight on f4, which despite being cosmetically pleasing, actually gives Blackburn a forced mate in 6 moves, which he now executes. And this is another good tactical exercise. See if you can spot this mate in 6. What should white play? In 3, 2, 1. Queen takes f4 is the double exclam worthy move to kick this off. Black's gotta take the queen. She's threatening to come into h6, but after bishop takes f4, here comes rook takes h5. Just sacking everything. Unbelievable. Threatening checkmate on h8, which now cannot be stopped. We have g takes h5. The rook is just replaced, prompting a resignation. there is no stopping rook to h8 checkmate. You can only delay it with bishop h6, rook takes h6, queen to g3 check, king takes g3, and rook h8 checkmate will be played next. Such a brutal demonstration of why his alias the Black Death is fully deserved. Which brings us to our final combination, executed by Blackburn in this position in 1899 with black against none other than the reigning world champion Emanuel Lasker, who missed a brutal combination, which you just might be able to spot if you pause the video and take a minute. But here it comes in 3, 2, 1, rook to h1 check, drawing the white king over to h1 so that after bishop takes g3, black is threatening queen to h4, which will be mate in 2. So you gotta take out that bishop with knight takes g3, but because of the king's position on h1, we now have a knight fork with knight to f2 check, winning Lasker's queen. The game went on for a bit, but there was no overcoming the material deficit, and Blackburn finished off the world champion in another 12 moves. So there you have it, a true chess genius who began destroying some of the world's strongest players only a few years after learning how to play. It just goes to show that with enough talent, nearly anything is possible. And can you even imagine how good Blackburn would have got if he had begun playing chess as a small child and studied it the way Bobby Fischer did? He could have easily become the strongest player in history. So to round out this video, I'm going to show you the opening trap that bears Blackburn's name as promised. It's called the Blackburn Shilling Gambit because, as the story goes, Blackburn used to win shillings by playing this trap against weak players. Although this story is disputed, some people say it never happened, but I'll show it to you anyway. You may have seen it. It occurs after the moves e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and bishop to c4. At which point, if you are playing black, and only if you think your opponent is very weak, you can play knight to d4, and hope they don't take the knight, which would give white a big advantage. What you want for them to think is that they can win a pawn with knight takes e5. And then you have queen to g5, hitting the knight, hitting the pawn, and if they were weak enough to play knight takes e5, then they will most likely think that they can get away with knight takes f7 with the fork. But you then play queen takes g2, counterattacking the rook on h1, which they will probably move to f1. You're going to play queen takes e4 check. They're going to block with the bishop because they don't want to lose their queen, giving you a very nice smothered checkmate with knight to f3 checkmate. The bishop, of course, is pinned to the king, cannot capture the knight. So there you have it, the legacy, the legend of the great Joseph Henry Blackburn, aka the Black Death, who is, in my opinion, the most naturally talented chess player of all time. Let me know in the comments if you agree, or if you know of another player who began playing at such a late age, who became a world-class player so quickly. I am open to revising my position, and I know there are other examples, but none so extreme that I know of. So for right now, in my mind, Blackburn is the man. And I'm looking forward to exploring more of his masterpieces, which I may cover in a future video. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing to the channel, and I will see you soon.